This is the story of Renaissance Italy's architecture and furniture. I am your narrator, Melina Janton, and joining me is our guide. His name is Filippo, and yes, he is a seagull. Now, why am I entrusting a seagull to take us on this journey through history? Well, you see, he is an expert. After all, his wings allow him to see Italy's architecture from a viewpoint most of us cannot, from the tippity top of a dome down to a column's base. Also, one of his friends drew a rather mischievous link between seagulls and architecture. You see, I went to Venice not too long ago, and while there I was walking with my mom. Out of the blue, seagull moose fell from the sky and landed on her. It was nasty, and oh so ridiculous. Like from the pages of a book ridiculous. Architecture and furniture from the Italian Renaissance is much the same as that. Not in their nastiness, of course. Overall, they are quite the opposite of nasty. However, they are, in many cases, over the top to the point of bordering on the ridiculous, since they have a penchant for extravagant ornamentation. Now, that is not to say that the abundant decorations of the Italian Renaissance were bad. They were neither bad nor good. Rather, different pieces of architecture and furniture were either bad, good, or somewhere in between. It all depended on who designed and created the particular thing. Same as now, there were people in the past who were good at what they did and others who were not. One of the best places to see this ornamental beauty is through furniture of the time. Key types of furniture include items such as the cassone, the Savonarola chair, and 16th century center tables. Ornamentation is also a key piece of Renaissance architecture, as you can see with the statues and carvings of Tito Olimpico in Vicenza. These four examples are each important to understanding the Italian Renaissance, and we'll get to why in just a little bit. Now, remember the whole seagull pooping on my mom incident? Well, it occurred in Venice, and in Venice, most anywhere you go, you are in a maze of buildings. So, it got me thinking. With so much architecture, and us people so small in comparison, I imagine that buildings suffer bird poop far more often than people do. And what buildings have had the most opportunities to be dirtied? It'd be the oldest ones, right? And what's another word for really old? Ancient. And where is Venice? Italy. And where was Italy in ancient days? The Roman Empire. And that, ancient Rome, is what formed the foundation for the Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance saw the renewal of ancient Rome's ideas. Thus, ancient philosophy, architecture, and furniture served as the inspiration for Renaissance philosophy, architecture, and furniture. First, we'll look at philosophy. The philosophy these two cultures shared was the idea of advancement and the new. For instance, if we're looking at this from an architectural perspective, then a marvelous example is Filippo Brunelleschi's dome of Florence Cathedral. Although this dome is rather Gothic in looks, the methods it was built with perfectly display the inventive attitude of the Renaissance. Because of the dome's size, it was impossible to build it using the standard methods of the time. Normally, builders would erect a wooden frame to hold up the dome until the keystone was set in place. However, the size of Florence Cathedral made that impossible. There simply wasn't any wood that was strong enough to support such a large dome. Brunelleschi addressed the problems associated with such a dome in several ways. First, his design meant that the dome would be as lightweight as something that large could possibly be. This was done by its hollow design, as the dome is made up of two shells. Second, the structure supported itself, even in construction. Large vertical ribs span the outside of the dome, somewhat like arches, and help bear its weight. Along with that, vertical and horizontal ribs are inside the shell, hidden from view, and they also help hold up the dome. Thus, the frame was built as part of the dome rather than as something separate that would be removed later. Thirdly, Brunelleschi displayed the philosophy of advancement through his engineering inventions, including hoist and a barge. His barge helped transport materials to the dome's location, and his hoist allowed those materials to be lifted high enough to get it built. Thanks to his incredible influence on architecture of the Italian Renaissance, Brunelleschi is regarded as the father of Renaissance architecture. Not only that, but his dome of Florence Cathedral is considered by many as the start of the Italian Renaissance, at least as far as architecture is concerned. If that is the case, then the Renaissance began in Florence, Italy, in the year 1418. However, others believe that the Italian Renaissance architecture began with the design of the gates of Florence Cathedral, created by Lorenzo Ghiberti, which would have set the start date at 1401. Now, let's examine architecture. There are many aspects of Italian Renaissance architecture that take inspiration from the Roman Empire. However, round arches, domes, decoration, and the five classical orders stand out as the most notable. The Renaissance took these pieces of ancient Rome and made them distinctly Renaissance by adding the fancy ornamentation that this period is famous for. St. Andrea's Basilica in the city of Mantua, designed by Leon Battista Alberti, is a notable example of round arches, because not only does it make use of them both inside and outside, but it also resembles a Roman triumphal arch. One of the most famous domes is that of Rome's Pantheon, an engineering wonder of its time. The Renaissance looked at such domes and decided to follow Rome's lead by pushing the limits. Thus, advancements were made, and the largest dome of that time was built in the very same city as the Pantheon, the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, designed by Michelangelo. As for decoration, I mentioned the statues of Tito Olimpico earlier. These statues and the overall ornamentation of the structure do a wonderful job depicting the classicism of the Italian Renaissance. In Vicenza, Andrea Palladino designed the Basilica Palladiana, a highly classical building which displays both arches and Ionic columns. And now on to furniture. Renaissance furniture tied to the Roman world in much the same way that architecture did, drawing inspiration from the ancients and then working from there to create something new and distinctly Renaissance. As mentioned earlier, this cassone, this chair, and this table are important examples when it comes to exploring the Italian Renaissance. This is because they clearly display the connection between the 15th and 16th centuries to ancient Rome. Cassone means chest, and their shape sometimes resembled Roman sarcophagi. Of course, they had drastically different uses since, if you don't know, a sarcophagus is essentially a fancy coffin. The cassone, on the other hand, was generally used as a wedding chest. Savonarola chairs such as this one were based on Roman chairs of the same style. They were built for comfort and sometimes served as folding chairs. Renaissance center tables like this one were built with marble and wood and are similar to Roman garden tables. In addition to individual types of furniture, classicism was also represented by the carvings of furniture, since designers sometimes depicted stories of Roman mythology in their decoration. Another tie to ancient Rome is the Italian Renaissance emphasis on symmetry, balance, and proportion. Like a seagull's wingspan or his tail feathers, the facade of Renaissance architecture was created to align in symmetrical harmony. The ideal rhythm was one of consistency and proportion. This, in the eyes of the Italian Renaissance, was perfection. A location in Rome that does a remarkable job demonstrating this is Michelangelo's Piazza del Campidoglio. This square and the buildings that form it are constructed in a symmetrical layout. Another square that reflects the rhythm of the Italian Renaissance is Piazza San Marco in Venice. Now, not all the buildings within this square came from the Italian Renaissance, but some of them did. One specific example is the Biblioteca Marciana, which began in 1537. Not only does this structure depict rhythm, but it also shows classical elements well, especially with its decorative statues, its Doric and Ionic columns, and its round arches. So, in summary, the Renaissance began in Italy. From there, it spread throughout the European world. As far as architecture is concerned, this period began toward the beginning of the 1400s, when classical ideas began to be implemented into architecture. This early Renaissance lasted for the remainder of the 15th century. The 16th century marked the High Renaissance, when classicism took off full force. In the midst of the High Renaissance, decoration became all the more important to Italy, and it is now seen as an integral aspect of Renaissance architecture and furniture. All that said, one might say that the architecture of the Italian Renaissance flew across the world as if it had wings. Perhaps they were seagull wings. All in all, Italy was the beginning and center of the Renaissance, and in this period, its architecture and furniture were, first and foremost, a renewal and expansion of classical ideas. In many ways, the philosophies of ancient Rome and the Renaissance continue today, these ideas of advancement and the exploration of the new. We can look at history and we can see a story, a timeline of how ancient architecture became historic and how historic architecture became modern. For you see, somewhere in Rome, there is a seagull named Filippo, eyeing the triumphal arches and the temples of ancient Rome. And if you go to Venice, you might walk into the same palaces and structures that people of the 15th and 16th centuries built and used. From there, you walk out into the street to rejoin the 21st century, and you could see a mischievous seagull soaring above a beautiful piece of Italian Renaissance architecture. Hopefully, he won't drop bird mush on you or it. And now, here's a few vocabulary words that Filippo the Seagull wants you to remember. Classical is basically just ancient Greece and Rome. So, a classical thing, such as classical architecture, just means ancient Greek and/or Roman architecture. Classicism is anything relating to ancient Roman things, like how the Renaissance used ancient Roman ideas in their architecture. Renaissance means rebirth, and the Renaissance refers to a period when classical ideas were readopted and spread across the European world in areas such as architecture, philosophy, art, and science. Orders were specific types of fancy columns first used in ancient Greece and Rome, and later also in the Renaissance. Rhythm in architecture has to do with how things flow or look, how they align or don't. It's linked with symmetry, harmony, and things like that. And here's my bibliography. And Filippo the Seagull, and also this mischievous friend of his up in the corner. And that's it. Ciao.